In 1991, the United States was caught up in the greatest outpouring of patriotism since World War II. The 100-hour conflict in the Persian Gulf had resulted in an apparent victory that gave America back her pride after having to live with the shame of Vietnam for almost 2 decades. Our Gulf War veterans returned to smiling faces, parades, and parties. Congratulations from well-wishers gave our troops a sense of belonging that had not been experienced for over a generation. America had heroes again, and at the top of the list was General Stormin' Norman Schwarzkopf, the leader of our armed forces who had led our men to a stunning victory over Saddam Hussein and his Republican Guard. However, in the years that have followed, many of our nation's guardians have fallen ill, and many have died. Thousands of our veterans have registered with the Veterans Administration and requested treatment at VA hospitals all over the country, and they've been either turned away and given a psychiatric diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and a prescription for Prozac, Busbar, Ativan, or any other psychotropic drug that apparently serves no other purpose than to sedate them. Meanwhile, their symptoms are being passed to their families and into the general population. Until recently, the Department of Defense and the Pentagon held steadfastly that there is no Gulf War illness. This despite the overwhelming evidence that there is, including several reports from Senator Donald Regal in 1994. In 1996, the Department of Defense and the Pentagon came under intense scrutiny and has, in many of Americans' eyes, lost their credibility. Recent testimony given at the Congressional Oversight Committee hearings, chaired by Representative Christopher Shays of Connecticut, have brought to light many facts that have remained hidden, not by Saddam Hussein, but by those in the highest offices of the departments that were created to protect America and its defenders from harm. Hi, my name is Dave Riddell, and for the next hour, we'll be analyzing the testimony that General Norman Schwarzkopf gave before the Senate committee in their hearings that were held on January 29, 1997. We'll hear General Schwarzkopf's own words as he testifies about his knowledge of the events both during and after the hostilities in the Gulf War. We'll also hear from Sergeant Dan Topolsky, who was the nuclear, biological, and chemical non-commissioned officer in charge, and he was in the bunkers at Camisea before they were detonated. He knows exactly what was in there, and he reported it back to CENTCOM. We'll also hear from Sergeant Kevin Wright, a Marine who was assigned a security detail and served as General Norman Schwarzkopf's bodyguard. We'll also hear from Captain Joyce Riley, who's been researching the Gulf War illness for the past 4 years. I should mention on the outset that during this analysis of the Schwarzkopf testimony, you will not hear opinion or conjecture from this reporter. You will hear the words from General Schwarzkopf, from Sergeant Wright, from Sergeant Topolsky, Captain Riley, and you'll hear from the direct reports of the NBC logs, the CENTCOM reports, and Senator Regal's report of 1994. I think it's only fair to mention that as General Schwarzkopf took his seat before the Senate panel, he was not sworn in. He was not asked to take an oath to tell the truth, so help him God. Now, in his opening prepared testimony, and I want to emphasize prepared testimony, he sat down and he read a statement, and this was in his prepared statement.
I never received, before, during, or after hostilities, any report of Iraqi use of chemical weapons, nor the discovery of or destruction of Iraqi chemical weapons.
Now, this statement is very important because, as I mentioned, it was a prepared statement. It was not an improvised response from a question that was asked of him. It was something that he'd thought out before he went to testify. Now, he said, and we'll play it again,
I never received, before, during, or after hostilities, any report of Iraqi use of chemical weapons, nor the discovery of or destruction of Iraqi chemical weapons.
Now, we're going to have to deal with this statement in 2 parts. The first part, I never received before, during, or after hostilities any reports of Iraqi use of chemical weapons. I now refer to the NBC, that's Nuclear, Biological, Chemical Desk Log, and these are the logs that General Schwarzkopf had to review every day. This particular log is dated the 3rd of March, 1991 at 15:16 hours, and now I read, Lieutenant Colonel Wade advised that Colonel Dunn has confirmed that the soldier of the 3rd Armored Division does have blisters characteristic of H. mustard chemical agent on his upper and lower left arm. This is clearly a report of a chemical weapon, on an American troop. The second half of his statement said, nor the discovery of or the destruction of Iraqi chemical weapons. Again, we refer to the NBC desk log. This report came in on the 27th of February, 1991 at 1800 hours, and it's in reference to nuclear biological agents and munitions. It says, and I quote, "They feel destruction of small quantities using field method is okay. Bulk, not defined, destruction is not approved because it may have great international implications." We also refer to the NBC desk log dated the 28th of February, 1991, and this one is dated at 1930 hours. It says here that the Fox GCMS has come up with indications of small concentrations of sulfur mustard after numerous tests. All possible inferences with petroleum products have been ruled out. They are outside the bunker now. No one has gone in. They've moved their EOD people up, but won't do anything until the morning. Now, these NBC desk logs apparently contradict what General Schwarzkopf had testified to in the Senate committee hearings on that January afternoon. So at this time, we'd like to bring in Sergeant Dan Topolsky from the United States Army. Once again, he was the nuclear, biological, and chemical non-commissioned officer in charge. He was at Camisea, and he was in the bunkers before they detonated them. Now, this is what Sergeant Topolsky had to say about General Schwarzkopf's opening statement.
General Schwarzkopf is lying. He knew all the way through the air campaign that they were getting positive readings, and we were getting positive readings for nerve agents and blister agents and lewisite mustard agents on all of our detection devices, everything from the M8 alarm all the way up to the Fox vehicles. I have congressional testimony, I have my own personal knowledge, and I also have copies of his own NBC logs from CENTCOM that he read every single day. He had knowledge of it all the way through.
Those sound like pretty powerful words from one who was charged with the responsibility of identifying all the munitions in the bunkers at Camisea before they were destroyed. We'll get back to Sergeant Topolsky's comments a little bit later, but now we'd like to return to General Schwarzkopf's prepared statement as he began his testimony before the Senate panel.
Certain people, for reasons of their own, have charged that I and my commanders knowingly placed our troops at risk to chemical weapons while we sought protection for ourselves, and subsequently engaged in cover-ups of chemical contamination of our troops. Such a statement at best demonstrates an abysmal ignorance of the standards of conduct that we expect of all military leaders in our armed forces today, and at worst is a blatant lie, which strikes at the heart of our armed forces, since it undermines the confidence of the mothers and fathers of America who place the well-being of their sons and daughters in our hands. Such a statement cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged.
Well, for General Schwarzkopf to make such a statement in his prepared testimony leads one to believe that somebody somewhere at some time had made some statements questioning his integrity. We're now going to hear a statement from Sergeant Kevin Wright from the United States Marines.
My name is Kevin Wright. I'm a sergeant, retired from Marine Corps, and I was attached to Central Command Joint Visitors Bureau in the region of Saudi Arabia, Dhahran, Kuwait, and Iraq. And while I was over there, I did see in Dhahran an airburst with a Scud missile coming in. Nothing touched it, and a cloud odor that came out. And it was stated by a lot of people that it was a chemical attack. The chemical alarms went off. I was there. I took the pills. I took the shots. I signed my name on a dotted line to protect and guard this country and the interests of this country. And now I'm sick. My wife and my daughter did not sign that dotted line to deploy anywhere. I did. And now my family's affected. My life is affected. I can't work. I'm in pain every day of my life. And over there, I seen it, I heard it, and it happened. And I can't understand. My question is why, General Schwarzkopf, would you sit there and say that your main priority is the welfare of your troops, and your troops are sick, We're very sick. And you're going to sit there and not stand up and help us? I thought of you as a gentleman. I cannot think of you more than anything but a traitor for doing this and not speaking out to help your people. General Schwarzkopf, I was your bodyguard. My job was to protect you. And I'm sick, and why can't you protect us? It's not right. And you know it. What I think should be done right now is that the President Bush, General Powell, General Schwarzkopf, I signed the dotted line. We all did. Don't lie to the American people. Speak out the truth. Speak it out now. It's been too long.
I don't believe that anything else needs to be said about Sergeant Wright's comments. We'll let them stand on their own. Let's return now to General Schwarzkopf's testimony, and we'll get back to the events at Camisea. This is what General Schwarzkopf had to say about Camisea.
As I stated, the first time I ever heard of Camisea was in 1996 when it was first announced by the Department of Defense, and nobody was more surprised than I was.
Now, Sergeant Topolsky has a comment about Schwarzkopf's prior knowledge of Camisea, but before we let you hear what Sergeant Topolsky has to say, let's fast forward about, 25 or 30 minutes into the testimony when General Schwarzkopf again had to answer a question about Camisea.
I remember General Franks came to me, and I assume it was Camisea he was talking about at the time, because it was about the same time frame, and talked about this huge ammunition dump that they had found with literally tons and tons and tons of ammunition in it, and there was no way they could possibly retrograde it, and I challenged him on that, and he convinced me that no, they couldn't retrograde it, and therefore they were going to destroy it in place, and I said, fine. Now that's Camisea.
Now that statement seems to directly contradict his first statement, which was again,
as I stated, the first time I ever heard of Camisea was in 1996 when it was first announced by the Department of Defense, and nobody was more surprised than I was.
After viewing General Schwarzkopf's testimony, which, by the way, was broadcast on C-SPAN nationwide and was replayed twice, I asked Dan Topolsky to make his comment in regard to General Schwarzkopf's knowledge of Camisea.
General Schwarzkopf, I know for a fact that you know or knew about Camisea prior to 1996. I was there. My name is Dan Topolsky. I was a sergeant. I was the NBC NCO for the 37th Engineer Battalion. I was in those bunkers. I identified suspected chemical agents and biological agents. I sent the information forward. We were instructed to blow it up anyway. And I am appalled that you will take the stance that you did not have any knowledge of it when we gave you the information and we were instructed from higher, which is you, to blow it anyway.
Now, I think at this time it would be advantageous for us to elaborate just a little bit of what Camisea was all about. Contrary to what the mainstream press and media would have you believe, Camisea was not just one bunker. It was, in essence, a city of bunkers. It was 100 bunkers and 40 warehouses, each the size of a Walmart. We're talking about approximately 7,500 tons of sarin gas. That's 7.5 million pounds, by the way. We're also talking about 2,500 tons of mustard gas. And again, that's 2.5 million pounds. Now, this whole story would never have come to light if it hadn't been for one soldier who brought a video camera inside the bunker and photographed these munitions before they were detonated. This videotape was presented to those at CBS's 60 Minutes program, and because of that, they did do a story, some of you may have seen it, in which Sergeant Topolsky and other members of the 37th Engineering Battalion got to tell their stories. But one of the things that they did not get to tell you, and one of the things that they did not show you from that videotape, was the fact that many of these munitions that were destroyed had American markings on them. Again, Sergeant Dan Topolsky.
You knew that we identified biological agents and chemical agents, nerve gas, mustard gas, and suspected biological agents within that bunker complex. And that was only what we could see on the surface because we were instructed not to disturb anything. So what was behind them is completely and totally unknown. And you know, as well as I do, that you and your staff did not allow the use of biological detectors within the entire theater of operations. If there was any biologicals in that bunker, and I suspect that there was, if there was any biologicals in those bunkers, you knew about it.
Now, I think it's important at this time to mention that I personally have viewed this videotape that was brought back from Camisea, and I have seen with my own eyes pictures of munitions with American markings on them, as well as markings that indicate that these munitions were brought in from Jordan and from the United Kingdom, from England, as well as the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, as I viewed this footage from this videotape, not one time did I see any munition with any Arabic writing on it. This would indicate that there were many different countries that were supplying Iraq with munitions, both conventional and chemical and biological, and these all were done so against the 1972 Geneva Accord, which clearly made it illegal for any country to manufacture, distribute, deploy, sell, or proliferate chemical or biological weapons. Now, when it comes to identifying chemicals and biologicals, here's what General Schwarzkopf had to say. Again, this is General Schwarzkopf's own words in his testimony before the Senate panel on January 29, 1997.
I would tell you that even though I had 40-some years in military service, if you were to bring in a bunch of ammunition and pile it up in front of me, and one of them was a 122-millimeter rocket with chemicals in it, I would not be able to tell you that that had chemicals in it, particularly if it was an Iraqi rocket with Arabic writing on it or something of the sort. We identify ours when we had them in a very specific way by color coding. I don't have the slightest idea what the Arabs did.
Now, that last statement leads me to a question. I have to ask this question. How is it possible that the commander of the coalition forces, and that's 28 countries, how is it possible that the commander of these forces would not be able to have that type of information at his fingertips? I don't know the answer to that question, but I would think that if we were going into an operation where we knew that Saddam Hussein had the potential for using chemical and biological weapons, and we knew that he did use them in the Iran-Iraq war because, after all, the United States had helped to supply both sides with chemical and biological munitions. How is it possible that General Schwarzkopf would not have this information at his fingertips? I again asked Sergeant Dan Topolsky to make a comment about General Schwarzkopf's testimony when it came to the identification of chemical and biological munitions.
General Schwarzkopf, you stated that you spent 40 years in the military and you could not identify an Iraqi chemical or biological munition. I spent 6.5 years in the military, and after reading the publications, I could detect chemicals and biological agents by their markings on the munitions, biologicals being the green bands, chemicals being the yellow or purple bands. We knew what we were dealing with when we blew up that bunker, or that bunker complex. We sent the information to you as to what we suspected was in those bunkers, and you or your staff told us to blow it anyway. You knew exactly what was in there prior to the detonation.
Ladies and gentlemen, I realize that this testimony being given by Sergeant Dan Topolsky is damning, to say the least, towards General Schwarzkopf's testimony. I think it's important at this time that we get a little bit of a background on Sergeant Topolsky, so I asked him to make a statement and let us know a little bit about himself.
My name is Dan Topolsky. I was a sergeant promotable. I was the NBC NCO for B Company, 37th Engineer Battalion. I was the commander's main advisor on all aspects pertaining to nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. I also was on the Camisea bunker complex mission. I am extremely appalled by the stance that my leaders have taken. The disinformation that's out there through the government and the government bureaucracies, it's allowing them to keep us from being treated. It's allowing them to, or enabling them to deny us just compensation for our disabilities. The entire situation completely and thoroughly disgusts me because they are not willing to tell the truth in order to remain politically correct within certain circles up in Washington, D.C. I suffer from most of the symptoms, all but about 2, for the Mycoplasma fermentans incognitus. I've been diagnosed as having organophosphate delayed effect neurotoxicity as a direct result of being exposed to nerve agents. My wife, within the last year, has had 5 surgeries. Of any of them, she has yet to find any comfort. All 3 of my children are sick. They have headaches, joint pains, skin rashes. I have a dog that has degenerative joint disease. And just recently, our medical insurance has been terminated because we used up our lifetime amount over the course of the last 2 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it bears mentioning that when 60 Minutes did their research and assembled that panel from the 37th Engineering Battalion in the summer of 1996, Sergeant Dan Topolsky was the only individual from that panel that did not show symptoms of the Gulf War illness. Since that time, he has, as he mentioned, developed those symptoms, and his wife has developed those symptoms as well as his children and his dog. And I would like to commend Sergeant Dan Topolsky as well as Sergeant Kevin Wright for having the incredible amount of courage that it takes to make the statements that they've made and to allow their voices to be used on this tape and on the many different radio broadcasts that Joyce Riley and I have been doing over the past several months. This courage is a demonstration of their love of their country, because after all, they're not facing Saddam Hussein and the Republican Guard. Now they're facing those in Washington who call themselves the United States government. Let's return now to the testimony that General Schwarzkopf gave on January 29, 1997, to the Senate panel convened to investigate the Gulf War illness. He was asked about detection of chemical and biological weapons on our troops, and this is what he had to say.
We never had a single symptom shown by any of our troop of known symptoms of any chemical contamination, and I never received a single report of the Iraqi use of chemicals.
Now again, we reference the Nuclear Biological Chemical Desk Log of the 3rd of March, 1991, and the time was 15:15 hours. And again, we referenced this earlier. It says, Lieutenant Colonel Wade advised that Colonel Dunn has confirmed that the soldier of the 3rd Armored Division does have blisters characteristic of H mustard chemical agent on his upper and lower left arm. Also, on the same date, at 18:10 hours, it says, and I quote, Sergeant Major Grosner advised that chemical casualty happened on the afternoon of the 28th of February. Now, these nuclear biological chemical logs, again, were the logs that General Schwarzkopf had to review every day. You decide whether he's telling the truth. Again, we reference General Schwarzkopf's opening testimony in which he made the following statement.
I never received, before, during, or after hostilities, any report of Iraqi use of chemical weapons.
Now, that statement is disputed in 2 different sites, the first of which is the Arison report dated July 14, 1995. It was a report done by H. Lindsay Arison III, who is the aide to the Undersecretary of the United States Air Force at the Pentagon. In Mr. Arison's report on page 4, and I quote, Section 5, U.S. chemical detection alarms were ineffective. The principal chemical agent detection alarm used during the war, the M8A1, was not sufficiently sensitive to detect sustained low levels of chemical agent and to monitor personnel for contamination. Further, the United States Army Materials Safety data sheets indicate that chronic exposures to levels of over 1/10,000th of a milligram per cubic meter to nerve agent sarin, which is GB, is hazardous and requires the use of protective equipment. The minimum level of chemical agent required to activate the automatic chemical agent detection alarm, the M8A1, commonly in use during the war, exceeds this threshold by a factor of 1,000. Now, to put this into perspective, that means that if it takes one drop to contaminate a swimming pool, then that would mean that it would take 1,000 drops to contaminate that swimming pool to a level that the alarm would go off. In other words, the chemical detection alarms, as Dr. Lindsay Arison had stated, were ineffective. In Section 6 on the same page, page 4 of the Arison report, it also states the United States did not have any biological agent detection capability whatsoever during the Gulf War. So if biologicals were used, there would be no way of our troops knowing. During the war, there is a reported 14,000 chemical alarms that did go off, and according to the Department of Defense and the Pentagon, 14,000 of them were defective. And now I cite the Regal report of May 25th, 1994 on page 6. It says, and I quote, Dr. Edward S. Hyman, a New Orleans bacteriologist, has treated a small number of sick veterans and several of their wives for bacteriological infections and has developed a protocol for treatment that has resulted in symptom abatement in many of his patients. Second, during the November 10, 1993 unclassified briefing for members of the United States Senate in response to direct questioning, then Undersecretary of Defense John Deutsch said that the Department of Defense was withholding classified information on the exposure of U.S. forces to biological materials. Now, this report is very interesting because this indicates that the senators that were sitting on the panel when General Schwarzkopf was testifying, of those senators, most of them were in the Senate when Senator Donald Regal presented this information in 1994. And as I just mentioned, in 1993 they were made aware of the possibility of our troops being exposed to bacteriological and biological weapons, according to John Deutsch. So how is it possible that these senators can sit there and look surprised when the testimony comes forward that our troops were exposed to something that made them sick? This brings up the issue of biological warfare. Now let's return to General Schwarzkopf's testimony and listen to what he had to say about some of the precautions that were taken to prevent our troops from being exposed to biological weapons.
The botulism, as I understand it, when we first went over there was no antitoxin. And the antitoxin that was eventually developed and given to us what was one that was experimental, was not approved by the FDA. It was for that reason that I insisted that any troop that was going to be given this botulism, first of all, be explained what it is and then sign a statement as to the fact that he understood this and agreed to take it. And if he didn't sign the statement, he didn't have to take the botulism antitoxin. I left it up to him because I knew it was not an FDA-approved antitoxin.
Now, this part of Schwarzkopf's testimony clearly indicates that the botulism shots that were given to our troops were voluntary. I hold in my hand a copy of the Orange County Register of February 4th, 1991, in which they reprinted an article from the New York Times written by Gina Colada. It says, and I quote, on December 21st, the Department of Defense obtained a special waiver needed to require troops to take experimental drugs and vaccines in case of combat or threat of combat. This indicates that these botulism shots and these vaccines were not voluntary, they were mandatory. The article goes on to say, and again I quote, although troops must accept standard medical treatments, until now they have not had to accept experimental ones without signing an informed consent statement. As far as I know, there has never been another situation in this nation where people waived their right to give informed consent to receiving experimental treatments, said Dr. Arthur Kaplan, director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the University of Minnesota.